Welcome back to True Crime After Dark, where we unravel the darkest corners of the human mind. This is part 2, The Undoing of a Monster. If you have not seen part 1, you should go back and watch it before this video to be fully informed. When Jeffrey Epstein walked out of jail in 2009 after serving just 13 months, many assumed, or hoped, that his life of privilege was over. His name had been in the papers. His crimes had been exposed. Surely he would become a pariah, but Epstein was no ordinary man. Despite the scandal, despite the dozens of survivors, he slipped back into the very world that had shielded him for so long. Epstein wasted no time re-establishing himself. He returned to his sprawling Palm Beach mansion and his towering Manhattan townhouse. He still had his private jets. He still had his private island, Little St. James, in the Virgin Islands. He still owned his massive New Mexico ranch. And once again, his homes became revolving doors for visitors. Survivors later said that Epstein's manipulation system never really stopped. The cycle of recruitment, grooming, and control continued, just as it had before. At his Manhattan townhouse, staff and neighbors noticed the constant arrival of young women, many appearing to be teenagers. In Palm Beach, the flow of visitors resumed. On Little St. James, boats ferried Epstein and his guests back and forth across the turquoise water, hidden from public view. Even after the 2008 conviction, Ghislaine Maxwell remained at Epstein's side. Survivors described how she continued to recruit and groom young women for him, presenting herself as both glamorous and trustworthy. One chilling detail emerged from New York. Maxwell was sometimes seen pulling over her car to approach young girls on the street, just as she had in the 1990s. She would strike up conversations, asking about their interests, their ambitions, their plans for the future. She spoke of modeling, scholarships, exciting opportunities, and then she would invite them into Epstein's world. Survivors from London, Paris, Florida, and the Virgin Islands later described eerily similar experiences. Maxwell wasn't just Epstein's companion. She was a key architect of his recruitment machine. Connections untouched. You might think Epstein's powerful friends would have abandoned him after his conviction, and some did, publicly at least. But disturbingly, many did not. Epstein continued to host dinners and gatherings attended by billionaires, academics, politicians, and celebrities. Photographs from this period show him with figures whose names carried global weight. He funded research projects and donated to universities, including Harvard. He cultivated relationships with scientists, offering money for cutting-edge experiments in genetics and artificial intelligence. By surrounding himself with brilliant minds, Epstein tried to reshape his public image from convicted offender to philanthropist and visionary. His private jet, nicknamed by some as the Lolita Express, continued to ferry guests around the world. Passenger logs later revealed names of celebrities, businessmen, and even politicians. While not all passengers were involved in crimes, the sheer volume of elite names raised questions. Why were so many powerful people still associating with a man who had been convicted of exploiting minors? On Little St. James, the private island, survivors later testified that Epstein continued to bring young women there, away from prying eyes. The island had a main mansion, guest houses, and a curious temple-like structure with blue and white stripes, which became the subject of endless speculation. Staff described how everything on the island was tightly controlled, with Epstein monitoring movements and visitors carefully. For years, despite his conviction, Epstein managed to keep his world intact. Mainstream media rarely touched the story. Survivors who tried to speak out were ignored, silenced, or buried in lawsuits. Epstein's lawyers threatened journalists with legal action. It wasn't until nearly a decade later that the silence began to shatter, thanks to a small group of survivors and the relentless work of investigative journalists who refused to let the story die. In 2018, the Miami Herald, led by journalist Julie K. Brown, published a groundbreaking series of articles titled Perversion of Justice. The series exposed the details of the 2008 plea deal, the failures of the justice system, and, most importantly, the voices of survivors. Women who had been silenced for years now had their stories told to the world. The impact was immediate. Public outrage exploded. Politicians were forced to answer questions. And suddenly, the Epstein case was back in the headlines, bigger and louder than ever before. The survivors who had once felt powerless now had a platform, and the world was finally listening. For nearly a decade after Jeffrey Epstein's 2008 conviction, the story seemed to fade from the spotlight. He had served his minimal sentence, returned to his mansions and private jets, and quietly reassembled his world of influence. But beneath the surface, anger was building. Survivors had not forgotten. Families had not forgotten. And a small group of journalists refused to let the case disappear into history. In 2018, investigative journalist Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald began digging into Epstein's story. She had questions. How could a man accused by dozens of survivors receive such a light sentence? Why were survivors not told about the plea deal? And what role had powerful lawyers and politicians played in protecting him? Brown and her team poured through thousands of pages of documents, court filings, and police reports. They tracked down survivors, many of whom had been teenagers when Epstein exploited them, and asked them to share their stories. The result was a bombshell series of articles titled Perversion of Justice. Published in late 2018, the series laid bare the corruption of the 2008 plea deal and gave a platform to survivors who had been silenced for years. For the first time in years, survivors' voices were front and center in national media. Their accounts were raw, emotional, and horrifying. They described how Epstein lured them with promises of modeling jobs, tutoring, or financial support, only to pressure them into cycles of S. Some recalled being recruited by friends who had already been trapped in the system, creating a pyramid-like network that fed Epstein's demands. Others remembered Maxwell's presence, noting how she used her charm to make Epstein's world seem glamorous and safe. The stories were remarkably consistent. Survivors across different states and even different countries described the same pattern: recruitment, the massage, the coercion, the silence. One survivor said, "I felt like I couldn't say no. He had so much power and I was just a kid. Who was going to believe me?" Another recalled how the money clouded her judgment at first. $200 felt like a fortune at that age. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt trapped. Their testimonies shattered the illusion that Epstein was merely guilty of bad judgment. They revealed a systematic exploitation network that had operated for decades and had been shielded by wealth and connections. The impact of Brown's reporting was immediate. Outrage spread across social media, cable news, and even political circles. People demanded to know how the justice system had failed so completely. Protesters gathered outside Epstein's homes. Politicians called for investigations. Survivors began filing lawsuits again, emboldened by the renewed attention. And Alexander Acosta, the prosecutor who had signed off on Epstein's 2008 deal and was now serving as U.S. Secretary of Labor, found himself under fire. Critics demanded his resignation, and he was forced to defend his actions in press conferences. The Miami Herald series didn't just reignite public outrage, it put prosecutors back on the case. Federal authorities in New York began reviewing evidence, and FBI agents reopened investigations. Survivors who had once felt ignored were now being interviewed again. By early 2019, the pressure was undeniable. The system that had once shielded Epstein was beginning to crack. The question was no longer if he would face charges again, but when. And in July 2019, the world got its answer. If you're finding value in these stories, please subscribe and hit the like button so we can keep telling the truths that must be heard. By the summer of 2019, the pressure on Jeffrey Epstein had reached a breaking point. The Miami Herald's reporting had exposed the truth behind his 2008 plea deal. Survivors were speaking out louder than ever. Politicians were demanding accountability, and federal prosecutors in New York were quietly building a new case. On July 6, 2019, it all came crashing down. Epstein had just returned from Paris, stepping off his private jet at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, the same jet that had carried celebrities, politicians, and royalty for decades. But this time, instead of assistants and chauffeurs waiting for him, federal agents were there. They arrested him on the spot. His home in Manhattan was raided. Inside, investigators found hundreds of photographs of young women and girls, some locked away in safes. They seized records, CDs, hard drives, and files. The evidence painted a chilling picture of a man who had never stopped his pattern of exploitation, not even after his conviction. Epstein was charged with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy, crimes that carried potential sentences of 45 years or more. At age 66, this was effectively a life sentence if he were convicted. The indictment. The indictment laid out in stark detail how Epstein operated. He recruited dozens of young women, some as young as 14, through a network of assistants and associates. He paid them cash after each encounter. He pressured some of them to recruit their friends, ensuring a constant flow of victims. He used his wealth, his homes, and his influence to trap them. The language of the indictment matched what survivors had been saying for years. This time, it was official. The federal government was calling Epstein's system what it was, a criminal enterprise. Epstein's lawyers immediately argued for bail. They proposed house arrest in his $77 million Manhattan townhouse, with guards he would pay for himself. They claimed he wasn't a flight risk. Prosecutors pushed back hard. They pointed to his 2 private jets, his overseas properties, and even a fake passport found in his safe. The passport was from Austria, bore Epstein's photograph, and listed a Saudi Arabia address. Alongside it, investigators found piles of cash and diamonds, a clear sign that Epstein was prepared to flee at a moment's notice. Survivors also spoke at the bail hearings, urging the court not to release him. Their voices, powerful and emotional, carried weight. On July 18, 2019, the judge denied bail. Epstein was remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Manhattan, a notoriously grim federal jail. For the first time in his life, Epstein was behind bars with no way to buy his way out. The arrest set off a global media frenzy. Newspapers across the world ran headlines. Television networks devoted hours to coverage. Social media erupted. Survivors who had been ignored for years were suddenly in the spotlight, their voices amplified on the world stage. They gave interviews, shared their stories, and demanded justice, not only for themselves, but for every young woman who had been silenced. But with Epstein in custody, questions began swirling. Would he name names? Would powerful people be implicated in court? How much damage could his testimony do to the world's elite? The answers to those questions never came, because just 1 month later, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan was a far cry from Epstein's mansions, private jets, and private islands. Built in the 1970s, MCC was notorious for overcrowding, harsh conditions, and chronic understaffing. Inmates described it as dark, filthy, and oppressive. For Epstein, who had spent his life surrounded by luxury, it was a nightmare. But for the survivors, seeing him finally behind bars, with no private chefs, no yachts, no way to buy his freedom, felt like a long overdue reckoning. Just a few weeks into his stay on July 23, 2019, Epstein was found in his cell with marks on his neck. Officials were vague about what happened. Some said he had attempted to unalive himself. Others suggested he had been attacked by his cellmate, a former police officer facing murder charges. Epstein himself claimed he didn't remember what had happened. Regardless, prison officials briefly placed him on suicide watch, meaning constant monitoring, cameras, and checks every 15 minutes. But strangely, he was taken off suicide watch less than a week later, a decision that baffled experts. Instead, he was placed in the special housing unit, where inmates were supposed to be monitored more closely than the general population. As Epstein awaited trial, pressure mounted. Prosecutors revealed they had seized hundreds of photos of young women from his Manhattan mansion. More survivors came forward, emboldened by his arrest. Civil lawsuits multiplied. Behind the scenes, speculation grew that Epstein might cut a deal with prosecutors in exchange for naming names. If true, this could have sent shockwaves through the global elite. Presidents, princes, billionaires. Many had flown on his jet or visited his homes. What secrets might Epstein reveal if pressed? The possibility of testimony put a target on his back, whether from his own fears, his powerful associates, or a mix of both. In the early morning hours of August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. Authorities reported that he had unalived himself by hanging. He was pronounced dead shortly after being transported to a nearby hospital. The official story was simple, but the details were anything but. The two guards assigned to monitor Epstein that night claimed they had fallen asleep and failed to make their required rounds. The cameras outside Epstein's cell block, the very ones that should have captured the night's events, were reportedly malfunctioning. Epstein had been taken off suicide watch just days earlier, despite the earlier incident. The coincidences piled up, and with them, suspicion. The aftermath of his death. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Headlines blared around the world. Survivors were devastated, robbed of the chance to face him in court. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire, fueled by the suspicious circumstances. The phrase "Epstein didn't unalive himself" became a cultural phenomenon. Shouted at protests, plastered across social media, even referenced in late-night comedy. To millions of people, his death felt too convenient, too perfectly timed to protect powerful people. The Department of Justice opened an investigation. The guards were charged with falsifying records, but to this day, many remain unconvinced by the official explanation. For some, Epstein's death was the end of the story. For others, it was just the beginning of new questions. Who was being protected? What secrets died with him? And why had the system failed again? When Jeffrey Epstein was pronounced dead on August 10, 2019, many thought the story was over. The man at the center of the scandal was gone. Survivors were robbed of their chance to face him in court. But in truth, Epstein's death only shifted the spotlight. If anything, it intensified it. The world still wanted answers. Who helped him? Who knew? And who else should be held accountable? The person at the top of that list was Ghislaine Maxwell. For years, Maxwell had lived in Epstein's shadow, his partner, confidant, and, as survivors testified, his recruiter and enabler. After his death, she all but vanished. Journalists speculated constantly. Where was she? Some believed she was hiding in Europe. Others thought she was being sheltered by Epstein's associates. Photos surfaced of her reading a book in Los Angeles, but her whereabouts remained largely unknown. Behind the scenes, investigators were working. Survivors demanded she be held accountable, filing lawsuits that named her as a central figure in Epstein's exploitation network. Prosecutors began building a case that would eventually bring her to trial. On July 2, 2020, federal agents raided a secluded mansion in New Hampshire. There, they found Ghislaine Maxwell. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including conspiracy to entice minors, conspiracy to transport minors, and perjury. The news sent shockwaves across the world. Survivors expressed relief. For the first time, someone else close to Epstein would face the justice system. Maxwell pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against her was substantial. Prosecutors argued she had played a direct role in recruiting, grooming, and normalizing Epstein's abuse. Survivors described how Maxwell would approach them, strike up conversations, and invite them into Epstein's orbit. She wasn't just a bystander, she was an active participant. In November 2021, Maxwell's trial began in New York City. Survivors took the stand, recounting harrowing stories of how Maxwell gained their trust and then delivered them to Epstein. One survivor testified that Maxwell had told her, "You're special. Jeffrey likes you. He can help your future." Another described Maxwell as, like an older sister figure who made Epstein's demands seem normal. Survivors said Maxwell was often in the room during encounters, sometimes participating herself, other times directing events. The trial was tense, emotional, and closely watched around the globe. Epstein was gone, but through Maxwell, the world heard the survivors' voices in a courtroom for the first time. On December 29, 2021, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on 5 of 6 counts. Maxwell was convicted of conspiracy to entice minors to travel for SA, conspiracy to transport minors with intent to engage in SA transportation of a minor with intent to engage in SA conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of a minor. She was acquitted of one lesser count, but the convictions were enough. In June 2022, Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For survivors, it was a long-awaited moment. She had been Epstein's right hand, the one who smoothed his lies with charm and made the impossible seem safe. Now she was facing consequences. For many survivors, Maxwell's conviction brought a measure of closure. They had faced years of being ignored, disbelieved, or silenced. To see someone so central to Epstein's crimes finally held accountable was powerful. but there was also frustration. Maxwell's trial raised more questions than it answered. Who else was involved? What about the client list? Why had no other high-profile figures been charged? Maxwell's conviction was a victory, but an incomplete one. Epstein was gone. The truth was still buried in sealed documents and secret settlements. Survivors wanted more. Jeffrey Epstein's story didn't end with his death in 2019 or Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction in 2021. In many ways, it had only begun. His crimes, the cover-ups, and the unanswered questions left behind changed how people view power, justice, and truth in modern society. The Epstein case became more than a scandal. It became a symbol of how wealth and influence can bend the justice system. Survivors had been silenced for years, prosecutors had cut secret deals, and evidence had been buried. To many, Epstein's story confirmed their worst suspicions, that those with money and connections live by a different set of rules. The outrage wasn't just about Epstein. It was about how easily institutions looked the other way. Epstein's unaliving became one of the most debated events of the 21st century. The phrase, "Epstein didn't unalive himself," spread like wildfire, turning into a cultural phenomenon. It appeared on protest signs, graffiti, bumper stickers, and memes. It was repeated in comedy routines, political speeches, and social media posts. But the phrase wasn't just a joke, it carried real meaning. For millions, it symbolized the belief that the truth had been buried, that the powerful had been protected, and that the public had been lied to. It became shorthand for distrust in government, media, and the justice system itself. The scandal also ignited a wave of documentaries, books, and podcasts. Investigative journalists and filmmakers worked to piece together the story that had been ignored for so long. Netflix's Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, gave survivors a platform to tell their stories in their own words. Books like Perversion of Justice by Julie K. Brown detailed how Epstein evaded accountability for decades. Podcasts and documentaries around the world dissected his connections, his money, and his methods. For the first time, the public could see the scope of what had been hidden and how deeply it shook those who lived it. Perhaps the most important legacy lies with the survivors. For years, they had been dismissed and silenced. But by 2019 and beyond, their voices were amplified like never before. Some became advocates, using their experiences to push for reforms in how cases of abuse are handled. Others spoke in documentaries and interviews, determined to ensure the world never forgets what Epstein did. Even after Epstein's death in 2019 and Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction in 2021, one haunting question continues to loom. Who else was involved? For years, investigators and journalists have spoken about Epstein's infamous contact book, often called his Little Black Book. Inside were the names, numbers, and details of hundreds of powerful people, politicians, businessmen, celebrities, royalty, and academics. Some were casual acquaintances, others were much closer. But the full scope of these connections has never been revealed. Much of the information collected during Epstein's investigations remains sealed. Court records, flight logs, and witness statements exist, but the U.S. government has withheld large portions of them from public view. Officials often justify this by saying that releasing the information could compromise ongoing investigations or violate privacy. But to survivors, these explanations feel hollow. Why, they ask, has only Epstein and Maxwell been held accountable when so many others clearly spent time in Epstein's world? Why have those who allegedly enabled or participated in his crimes never been brought into the light? The secrecy has fueled anger, distrust, and speculation. For many, it feels like proof that the powerful are still being protected. If the government won't provide transparency, survivors are determined to do it themselves. In recent years, many have begun speaking out publicly, naming the names of people they encountered in Epstein's orbit, sharing their stories in interviews, podcasts, documentaries, and lawsuits. Some survivors have even begun compiling their own lists, not just of clients, but of enablers, recruiters, and high-profile figures who turned a blind eye. While not every name on these lists represents someone guilty of crimes, survivors believe the world deserves to know who was in Epstein's circle, who visited his homes, and who may have looked the other way. It's a form of reclaiming power. For decades, Epstein and his allies controlled the narrative. Now, the survivors are writing the record themselves. The fight for truth continues in courtrooms and the press. Survivors are still filing lawsuits, journalists are still pushing for sealed records to be released, and the public is still demanding answers about the client list and the people Epstein once surrounded himself with. For many, the story won't truly be over until every name is known, every enabler exposed, and every survivor heard. Jeffrey Epstein is gone. Ghislaine Maxwell is behind bars. But the larger system that protected them, the culture of silence, corruption, and power without accountability, still lingers. And so survivors continue their fight, determined not to let the truth be buried. The government may hold its secrets, the powerful may hide in the shadows, but the survivors are stepping into the light. And with every story they tell, every record they share, every name they reveal, the world moves one step closer to understanding the full truth about Epstein's empire and those who helped sustain it. Their bravery forced the truth into the open. Their courage made sure Epstein's story would not fade into history. If you're finding value in these stories, please subscribe and hit the like button so we can keep telling the truths that must be heard. Despite the documentaries, the trials, and the books, one haunting fact remains. Epstein's story is incomplete. His network was vast. His client list remains hidden. His powerful associates remain shielded. This unfinished nature is what keeps the story alive. It lingers as a cultural wound, one that continues to remind us of what happens when money and influence go unchecked. When we step back from the mansions, the jets, the islands, and the headlines, one truth cuts through everything. This story is about the survivors. Jeffrey Epstein built a world designed to silence them. He used wealth, influence, and fear to strip them of their voices. For years, the justice system failed them. The media ignored them. Society doubted them. And yet, they spoke anyway. It was survivors who first went to police in Palm Beach in 2005. Survivors who told their stories to journalists when prosecutors turned them away. Survivors who testified in courtrooms, facing down powerful lawyers and unrelenting scrutiny. Their courage cracked the wall of silence. Their voices brought Epstein's empire down. For many, the scars are permanent. Lives were derailed, dreams were destroyed. But their persistence forced the world to confront the truth. And that truth will not be forgotten. Epstein may be gone, Maxwell may be imprisoned, but the legacy of this case does not rest in their names. It rests in the bravery of those who refuse to stay silent. To every survivor who stepped forward, your voices matter, your strength matters. And history will remember you not as victims, but as the ones who fought to shine a light in the darkest of places. As we close part 2 of this saga, remember this. Power without accountability is a danger to us all. Epstein's story is a reminder that no amount of money, no number of connections should ever outweigh justice. And though much remains hidden, one truth cannot be buried. Survivors spoke, and the world listened.